Hello! Welcome to the Massachusetts General Hospital Frontal Temporal Disorders Unit Community Forum Friday webinar series. My name is Katie Brandt. I'm the Director of Caregiver Support Services and Public Relations, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Today, our session is Understanding the Research Experience. Many of you may know that the MGH FTD Unit is a clinical research program. This means that we are committed to providing the highest quality of care while working tirelessly for a cure for frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and related disorders. In order to work towards that cure, we need to do research to better understand the conditions we care for. Our program typically provides clinic services to patients a day or two a week, and the rest of the time is spent on research. I hope that today's session will help you have a stronger connection with our research team and a better understanding of the research experience. I am thrilled to start the session today with two members of our research team, Megan Quimby, Director of Speech and Language Program, and Amelia Jones, Clinical Research Fellow in our Speech and Language Program. Megan, Amelia, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of today's session. Many people know that the treatment of primary progressive aphasia is one of the specialties of the MGH FTD unit. And Megan, as the director of our speech and language program, I think you are one of the best people to talk to about what is the research that we're currently doing for PPA and really communication disorders overall.
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of evaluations these days remotely. We've switched over primarily to doing evaluations remotely because of the pandemic, but it's going really well. We are able to have baseline evaluations with patients, see how they're doing when we first meet them in regards to their speech and language and communication, and then every 6 months to a year follow up to see if there have been any changes. And this allows us to know how the patients are doing, what type of strategies would be helpful for them, and really monitor how they're doing, so when there are treatments available, we can know, how are these treatments working, how are they affecting people's communication.
Right, and what's the term that you would use for a research study that is following and, trying to learn more about the patient experience?
I would say that it is more of a natural history type of research study because it allows us to talk with the patient as well as the family members and use testing materials to see, in the clinic, how are they performing on these pencil and paper tests, look at their speech samples, see how we can analyze those in regards to how are they functioning in everyday life, looking at activities of daily living, and just really talking with both the family member and the patient and see how they're doing as well as how we can help on a day-to-day basis.
I think that it's so important, and I love it that not only is our program full of expert clinicians and scientists, but we have a real dedication to training the next generation of clinicians. So Amelia, you are a great example of that as a clinical fellow. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your experience has been with our patients?
Yeah, so I pretty much have just jumped right into doing some language evaluations for these research projects. It's been great because though I get the technical experience of learning how to administer exams and things like that, it's a great way to connect with the patients and actually talk about how they have been doing in their daily lives outside of wherever we see them. And I get a really clear picture of who these people are, what they're dealing with, what's hard, what's easy, what gives them hope. So it's been wonderful. I have a lot more to learn, but It's been a great start. And so at the moment, as Megan said, this is really the main research project we're working on language-wise, but there will definitely be more to come.
I love what you just said about like what gives them hope, because one of the things we know about why we're engaged in research is that we want to get ready. We want to, all of our clinicians and scientists, our family community, to be ready when treatment's available. So when you think about someone says, I'm ready to participate in research, I'm living with a diagnosis of primary progressive aphasia, what might be the experience that they would have when they signed up for a research project?
Yeah, so I would say they usually come in to either see us in person or remotely for these speech and language evaluations in regards to the speech and language team. So they do an evaluation, we talk with the patient as well as the family, and then Amelia has been doing a lot of referring patients to an outpatient speech and language clinic, and that involves treatment, for instance, learning compensatory strategies to help with everyday communication, just a little bit more education about the diagnosis in general to know what to expect. And so we do the evaluations so that way we can recommend, treatments with other licensed speech and language professionals, and they can work on a weekly basis with these treatment strategies, as well as it allows us to gather more information about how we can structure a treatment program in the future and how we can best help these patients and families, while at the same time referring them to speech and language pathologists who know and who are educated about primary progressive aphasia.
I think what you just described there was something that we really hold as a value in our program, which is person-centered care planning and even precision care planning. So I know that I've benefited from education from you, Megan, to understand that there's more than one type of PPA. And actually, many of the neurodegenerative diseases that we care for present communication challenges. But those challenges aren't exactly the same for every person who's living with a diagnosis.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just going to say Amelia is going to be doing speech and language evaluations for actually diagnoses outside of primary progressive aphasia. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why that's important.
Often, other diagnoses, even though speech and language symptoms aren't the main presenting symptom, they can affect communication. And communication, as we all know, is a huge part of our daily life. And so when breakdowns occur, it can be super frustrating. So again, outside of primary progressive aphasia, it's still important to do those language evaluations so that we can pinpoint what areas of language are causing trouble, and we can offer strategies to help make those challenges a little bit easier and less frustrating for you and for the person with the diagnosis and their care partner.
I know that for many families, I have the privilege of working with families and talking with them about their goals of care. And I'm always so touched by how goals of care often start with relationships and love and connections. And communication is such a big part of that. But what we like to remind people is that communication is more than words. And so even if you're living with a diagnosis and struggling with your words, working with a speech language pathologist on compensatory strategies that can help you communicate your feelings, your wants, your needs, or even just an idea, that can really be something we can help with. Could you talk a little bit? I know you had mentioned that you were collecting speech samples and working to analyze them. Could you help me understand why is that important, or what information are you hoping to learn when you analyze a speech sample?
Yeah, Amelia, you can help with this too. But I think that what we're really trying to look at is different parts of speech and language in general, but really we want to look at how they're communicating, in a normal fashion and like what that means. So for instance, maybe they are a little bit tangential. Maybe they talk about personalized ideas more than they used to, or they might speak in shorter fragments, or they may speak a little faster than they used to or a little bit slower. So we really want to look at the different parts of that speech sample so we can see, maybe this subtype of PPA does this and this subtype of PPA does that, or this individual person does this, and what does that mean, and how can that allow us to figure out more about this disorder, and hopefully even use that as like a treatment outcome. Do their speech and language samples change if we try this treatment? To really look at, get further away from, does this paper and pencil test change, or does their daily communication or their functional communication change with whatever treatment we try next?
I was thinking too that the pencil and paper tasks, the more structured assessment subtests, they can give us a good idea of some quantitative data about different areas of language, but a lot of people perform very differently on tests than they do in natural life. So looking at these fluid natural speech samples can tell us a lot more about, like Megan said, the different subtypes and how they change over time and how treatments might change them as well.
And just really thinking about, again, that person-centered value, that clinically meaningful outcomes. Okay, so if we came up with a treatment or a drug that increased your score on a paper and pencil test, but when you went home, you couldn't communicate with the people you loved or engage in the activities that were meaningful to you, is that valuable to your life? So this type of research where you're observing people, you're following them over time, those natural history studies, I want to really emphasize how much we value research participation in this realm, because this is giving us the foundational information that we can use for real treatment. And I mean real treatment as to say disease modifying treatment in the future, which is of course our community's goal. Have you had any questions from research participants or families about why they have to do testing over time? Is there anything that comes to mind that you would like to share with our community today about any nuance of the research?
Well, I do want to emphasize that the patients and families being part of this research is really important to us, and we realize that, for instance, spending an hour plus time doing paper and pencil testing is not the most fun experience.
No, it might not be.
Yeah, so we do find it important because it allows us to really know what's happening in the progression of the disease, and it allows us to get to know the patient and the family more and be able to personalize the recommendations for treatment a little bit better as we follow them over time. It's a little bit harder to do that if you just meet them one time and you only do one evaluation, because things unfortunately do change over time, and we want to best help, in the best way we can. So.
And, we mentioned, as Amelia is here, that we have this commitment to educating the next generation of professionals. But there are professionals right now who are working with individuals with communication disorders that might not have experience with primary progressive aphasia. And since that's our specialty, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you've shared an instrument that we created in our lab, the PASS, and how that's a part of, or a result of research in a way.
Yeah, it's the Progressive Aphasia Severity Scale, and it allows us to better monitor how patients are doing over time. So it entails a bunch of different speech and language areas. So articulation, reading, writing, auditory comprehension, word retrieval. So it really allows us to finely tune how we're examining patients. So it's on a 0 to 3 scale, and we rate each of these areas of speech and language every time we see them. So it allows us to really get at how are they changing, what areas are not changing, what areas are changing. And that's been widespread now. I think it's, hundreds of clinicians. Every day, clinicians reach out and ask for the scale so they can monitor patients in the same way we are, which is really important because it allows us to collaborate more easily with other centers as well on our research.
I know that you've shared it on a global scale. And just thinking about how we recognize that we are a specialty unit dealing with rare disorders, and that not everyone all over the world has close geographical access to a clinical team like ours. But I just want to thank you for your contributions to the community and helping so many families because of that.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that, clinical fellows and students working in our program, now Amelia is reaching out to other speech and language pathologists and providing recommendations for treatment that they were unaware of beforehand. So it's really important, I think, to train other speech language pathologists in this area because it's not taught in school, and things like the PASS and training programs allow speech and language pathologists to know how to work with these patients because they're very unique. So it's important.
I feel very lucky to be able to work here, and I think it's very important that this lab is offering this clinical fellowship too, because even if I don't stay here forever, I might go to another area and be able to teach the other speech pathologists about PPA where they might not be as familiar with it. And so we'll keep filtering people through this program, teaching them about it, and spreading the word. It's very important.
And I think that not only brings better treatment for individuals living with those diagnoses, but more dignity and really an acknowledgement of that lived experience of, what is it like to live day to day with this unique type of communication disorder? Yeah. I think that we should give a plug for the Learning Livecast webinar that the speech and language team did, which folks can find on our MGH FTD Unit YouTube channel called More Than Words, which is something that I think clinicians could benefit from watching, family members who've just received a diagnosis. It really explains the different types of PPA and does talk about treatment and research options. So if someone is interested in participating in research, they want to raise their hand and say, I'm ready, I want to hook up with Amelia and do many hours of testing. I can't wait.
Blast.
Should they email the MGH FTD unit? Should they call us? How can they best reach you?
Yeah, I would recommend emailing the FTD unit. And then we have wonderful members of our team that work with these referrals and get them into the clinic so we can get to know them there, and then figure out which research studies that they should be a part of, and hopefully welcome them into our research program as well.
That's awesome. So before we wrap up today, I really want to ask you both. I'll start with Amelia. Is there something about your experience working with our community of patients and families that gives you hope for the treatments of the future?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I see new patients and their care partners come in scared, confused, and just they don't know much about what's going on, what's going to happen, but they still are so strong and are able to, put in the work and keep a positive mindset about the whole thing. And looking at how the members of our lab and the members of our team are working so tirelessly, and there's always something new, some new project going on. It just feels like, without a doubt, sometime in the future we'll have a pretty good cure.
Megan, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I have hope every single day I work in this position. I just think between the patients showing up and doing the work and, even smiling, sometimes, and the family members, you can just feel their love for their loved ones and this community. It gives me hope. And like Amelia said, just everyone in our team is so passionate about helping patients and family that it gives me hope that there is a cure sometime soon.
Me too. Well, thank you guys for being a part of this aspect of our webinar, and I look forward to all the work we're going to continue to do together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The MGH FTD unit could not conduct the incredible research that we're doing without partners. One of our most important partners is the Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging. I've interviewed Dr. Bruce Rosen to tell us more about the center and the ways that they participate in our research programs. So I just would love to introduce you today. Dr. Bruce Rosen is director of the Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging at Massachusetts General Hospital and professor of radiology at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Rosen, thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Oh, it's great fun. Thanks very much.
So I think that, right off the bat, people are probably wondering, why is Katie interviewing the director of the Martinos Center? What does that have to do with research in the FTD unit? And I was hoping that maybe you could just start by explaining what is the connection with the Martinos Center and Mass General Hospital, Martinos and our research community, maybe just a little overview.
Well, maybe a place to start is, what is the Martinos Center and what do we do within our universe? And I think that'll help answer the question. It's maybe even worth starting with our full name. We don't always use it to try to shorten things up, but our formal name is the Athenula A. Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging. So who is Athenula? Athenula was a young woman, a student at MIT, the daughter of a Greek shipping family, who very sadly committed suicide following a mental illness. She probably had undiagnosed schizophrenia. And in trying to come to terms with the grief of losing a child, nothing, of course, is more soulfully felt than that, the family was interested in developing a program that would help scientists and clinicians actually be able to understand what's happening in the brain of people with mental illnesses, not just schizophrenia, but all the different illnesses of the brain. Everything from stroke and brain tumors to mental illnesses like schizophrenia, depression, and of course, dementias, a very important part. So they very generously gave a gift to start the Athenula Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging, because they were convinced that being able to actually look into the brains of our patients, and of course, to be able to understand how even normal brains work using the tools of modern brain imaging would help us understand the normal brain, help us understand how the brain doesn't work, where it goes wrong, would help us evaluate new treatments for the brain more rapidly to be able to actually see whether the brains are changing in the ways that they would need to change in order to get better, and ultimately help develop the ability to help more patients by being able to diagnose sooner, evaluate treatments, and make sure those treatments were directed to the right patients. And so the Martinos Center set out with this mission to develop the tools and then to apply the tools. This kind of joint mission, build new tools, and then let's think about how we could use them ultimately to help our patients.
I mean, what a beautiful example of how philanthropy can be healing and establish a legacy to really say, you know, I don't want another family to experience what we've experienced.
Very
And
true.
yeah, I know that our program has benefited from philanthropy, but it's so moving to hear you tell that story about the origin story of the center.
It could never have happened without that philanthropic gift, that catalyst, because that was the gift that allowed all these different groups, the physicists, the engineers, the computer scientists, and the psychiatrists and neurologists, the radiologists, all to come together in one place, in one building, to work together and to take on problems that are at the earliest stages. You know, we're very fortunate living here in the United States, where we have things like the NIH, which provides a lot of money for research, and that's incredibly valuable. But at the earliest stages, the government really only funds work that's more mature, more established. It's a very conservative body. If we want to explore new ideas, develop new tools, or test those tools in conditions or in ways that we've never done before, the NIH will say, well, do the experiment first, and then come back to us and ask for money. Well, where are we going to get the resources to do that first experiment, to build that first camera, or put the first set of patients in? That's where philanthropy is so important. And for us, it was vital with the Martinos Center. When we started, we were a tiny little group. You know, now we're a much larger group. A lot of that funding, of course, comes in from the government, but it never would have happened without that spark that the Martinos Center gave us. And I know in your program, you depend on philanthropy for exactly that same thing. And it's so important. I agree.
Well, and you just use that word spark. I think about
That's our little spark.
That's your spark on your logo.
That's right. That's exactly what it's supposed to be. That's right.
It's also, I've had the pleasure of being able to tour the Martinos Center and able to see the creative minds at work. I've joked that your team, they sometimes approach like a new MRI scanner as maybe another person might approach a lawnmower, that they want to take apart and see how it's working, and just that approach of fearlessness with this incredible technology that paves the way to innovation.
Although I will say, I'm much more afraid of a lawnmower than I am of our MRI systems. And I would much rather have an MRI scan than have to go out and mow the lawn.
Okay, well.
Much easier and much, much safer. No spinning blades in our MR scanners. Very, very safe, very relaxing, a little noisy, though not nearly as noisy as a lawnmower. It's a great analogy by comparison.
I think that families are really curious about, you know, number one, what are the types of scans that someone who's participating in an Alzheimer's disease or related dementia research study might get? And then I think they have questions about, are there risks associated with getting those scans?
Very important questions and legitimate questions. I won't deny that when you see these big machines, a big magnet or a PET scanner, they can seem pretty intimidating. And so, you know, in that regard, I didn't mean to make light of the fact that, you know, it's serious business for sure. However, in fact, all of the tools that we use, and I'll go through them, really are very safe. So let's go through them. So we do a lot of MRI. I talked about that. And that's probably the technology that more of your patients and their families are aware of. Of course, we do MRI scans to study patients with their brains, but we do them if they twist a knee or have low back pain. There's a lot of reasons we use MR. It's a very, very common test. And the scanners that we use at the Martinos Center are very much like the scanners that you would go into if you sprained your ankle or twisted your knee or had low back pain, any of those conditions. Many of them are the same. I will admit we tend to supercharge them a little bit at the Martinos Center. We like to kind of push those limits, But from the standpoint of the patient and their families, you would look at them, they would look identical. Patient table, a magnet, you kind of slowly get put in it, very much the same. The MRI systems themselves are very, very safe. They don't use any x-rays. We don't typically inject anything into people. There are some risks associated with an MRI scan only if people are not careful and were to bring some metal into the room. And so we're extremely careful. You'll see there are metal detectors at the door, and all of our technologists always pat themselves down reflexively when they go in. And of course, we do thousands and thousands of MR scans across our entire health system a year. I've never heard a patient in that way. So MR is a wonderful tool. It's probably our most commonly used tool because it's so powerful and the images are so compelling. The only issue we hear, because the magnet tends to be a somewhat longer tube, some people feel it's a little claustrophobic. And so we have to work with patients so that they're aware of what they're going. We can give them things so that they have goggles so that they can see out and actually see visual things or hear music while they're in the scanners, just like the clinical scanners do. Basically take people's minds off of that claustrophobic environment. For me, I go in the scanner, I fall asleep immediately. I find it very relaxing. Your mileage may vary, people are different, but it's a very safe and very common procedure, and really no different from if you had an MR scan for almost any other purpose. We're very fortunate at the Martinos Center, though, to have some additional tools that we use, which give us somewhat different looks at the brain. For example, we have one tool with a very long name, magnetoencephalography, but we usually just initialize it MEG or MEG. That's a tool that allows us to look at electrical activity in the brain, a lot like an EEG, which is something that maybe your patients or their families are more familiar with, but with even more detail that can see the electrical activity with greater clarity and resolution than just an EEG machine does. Actually, the Mass General is the only clinical MEG machine in all of New England. We use it in patients, for example, with epilepsy, where it can identify the epileptic seizures much more precisely than EEG can and other tools. But we also have used it for some of our dementia studies because of its ability to see how the brain coordinates activity literally millisecond by millisecond. MR is a great tool, but not as fast. It takes seconds to take our pictures. EEG and MEG together take our pictures in milliseconds, in thousandths of a second. And so can literally watch thoughts as they're passing from one part of the brain to the other in real time. It's really quite remarkable. And so it's very useful as we try to understand how dementia can impact our ability to coordinate different parts of our brain into these coherent functions of memory and cognition, recognition, speech. These all require not one part of the brain, but different parts of the brain across the entire brain to work together and for information to pass from one part to the other, all very, very quickly. And so watching that process is something that's a unique province of MEG technology. And so we use that. Another tool that we use very commonly is PET imaging, positron emission tomography is its full name. We call it PET, P-E-T. PET is also unique because it teaches us about the chemistry of the brain. Many of your patients may be aware of the buildup of things like amyloid and tau in the brain. They may have heard about these proteins. PET is the way we can directly image them. MR is a great tool, but doesn't see them. MEG sees the electrical activity, but doesn't see these proteins and how they're building up and where they're building up. We can do blood tests that can see some element of them, and many of your patients may have had those blood tests, those blood biomarkers, but they can't tell us where they're building up, and they can't tell us how much is building up in the different parts of the brain. That's what PET can do uniquely. PET it's friendly. Actually, we have somewhat unique PET devices. Many elements of the Martinos Center are unique because our PET scanners are actually inside MR scanners. because the two of them work beautifully together. The MR scan gives us this exquisite anatomy, these beautiful pictures of the structure of the brain, and then we can overlay exactly where the molecular changes, where these chemical changes are occurring in the brain. And we can do it all in one scan. So we don't have to take an MR scan and then move the patient into a separate PET scan. We can do it all together. It's not terrible if we do them separately, but it's kind of a convenience, and there's certain advantages to doing them all together. So we use all of those tools to try to understand the big picture of what's happening in patients with dementias of all kinds. Are there changes in blood flow that we want to look at? We can do that with MR. Are there changes in the molecular pathways? We can do that with PET. Is the way the brain is orchestrating its coordinated function, is that what's going awry? MEG tells us that. So we can really use all of these tools to try to get a comprehensive view of what's happening in the diseases in general, and we hope ultimately what's happening in individual subjects, so we can really target the appropriate treatments for those patients. And this is what we're doing the research to try to understand, so that in the future, when a patient comes to us, we'll be able to tell them precisely what the problem is, and then hopefully precisely what the best treatment is to treat that problem.
I just want to say, first of all, Dr. Rosen, you are a passionate educator about this. I can hear, even the way you describe the images and their beauty, that this is not just
much.
No.
So sweet to put it the way you did.
This is not just work for you. This is a passion.
Yeah, that's for sure. No, I'm. It's the lucky man or woman, of course. I think you probably share this with me, that gets to do what they want and get paid a little bit for it. And I'm very, very, very fortunate to be able to do this. This, for a guy like me, I love the technology. As a young boy, I built my own telescope in the backyard, and I was a ham radio operator, and I just loved building things. But of course, then I trained in medicine, and of course, was fascinated by the brain and learning about the conditions of the brain, and the ability to bring both together, to apply the technology to understand the most complex machine there is, the human brain, and then of course to even go further to try to direct that understanding to helping people. Like, what's better than that? Nothing.
It's so amazing too to hear you talk about the idea of precision medicine, your own unique brain image, and how targeted we can make treatment one day when we know exactly where people are suffering and why they're suffering.
Absolutely. It's a big part of the work of your clinic. I know that. And of course, we're very happy to work, with Dr. Dickerson and the rest of the team there on their projects, and many other physicians and scientists throughout the center are all, interested in exactly understanding what's specific about each patient. We know their genetics is different, what their experiences are different, and how their brain reacts to those experiences are different. So to think that there's going to be one magic bullet that's going to solve the problem of dementia, I don't think we're going to be that lucky. I think it's going to require us to really understand in each individual patient what their problems are, and then target the treatments towards that. And we're making great strides in that direction.
Well, that was going to be my final question for you today. What is it about the work that is being done at Martinos that gives you hope for one day effective treatments, a cure, hopefully prevention of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias?
Yeah, what a fabulous question. And of course, I wish we were already at that prevention, point. But of course, the key to prevention is being able to understand what is it that causes this kind of cascade of events that ultimately leads to patients and their inability to, function in their daily lives. But we know, in large measure, from the kind of studies that colleagues like Dr. Dickerson and others have been doing over the last 20 years, that these changes begin in the brain not just a few years before, but decades before. The molecular changes, the buildup of these abnormal proteins, the inability for certain brain networks to function together, the abnormalities in electrical activity, all of these things we now know occur a decade or even 2 decades before patients lose their function. And so one of the keys to prevention is to be able to identify who are the patients that are most at risk, who are the patients that are beginning to suffer from the earliest changes, but before there's any degree of brain loss and cognitive decline, so that we can intervene. And of course, what's the specific nature of that pathology? We know, for example, some patients have a very significant vascular component to their dementia. Their blood vessels aren't working well the same way people develop heart disease. But just like with heart disease, you don't want to wait till somebody has a heart attack. You want to measure their blood pressure and evaluate them and intervene early. We believe the same is going to be true in the brain, but in the brain, it's a little harder. We can't just take their blood pressure and know what's going on in the blood vessels in the brain. But we can do these imaging studies that we're doing with MR and with PET to actually see the changes early. And then, of course, we're now learning a lot about how to prevent, slow down, and ultimately prevent the accumulation of vascular pathology. We've learned a lot from the heart that we can apply to the brain, but we need to know who to apply it to. And that's where our tools can be so useful. Similarly, for the changes in these proteins like amyloid and tau, we've now learned not only do they develop early, but we've used our tools to actually show that we can develop treatments that can begin to remove them. And of course, I know all of your patients are well aware of the first drug that was approved. I think the first of many that are to come. We know that they can remove the amyloid, but is that the whole story? Can we start even earlier in those patients? Will they be more effective the earlier we apply them? Are there other compounds that we'll need to do at the same time? Do we also at the same time need to look after their vascular health, or perhaps address other biological problems that also we know contribute? I suspect the answer is likely to be yes, if we're really to be effective at these early preventions. And so again, the things that we're learning about the detailed mechanisms and biology of how these diseases evolve will directly translate to how we can develop new treatments, and even more important, just as you say, how we can prevent the disease from ever happening, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Let's start preventing these things, but that means we really got to wind back the clock. And I'd like to think that the tools we're developing, are going to be a part of it. Not the whole part, of course, but I hope a very useful part.
Well, and what an endorsement as well for participation in research studies, because you can be an incredible scientist, you can have all the right technology, but if you don't have research participants, how can you conduct the studies that you need to help to bring more information to increase our knowledge?
Katie, this is such an important point. I mean, we know medical research advances with a lot of tools, with things in test tubes, with animal models and mice, but there is no substitute for the human condition and the human disease. We don't have anything that really replicates the full constellation of conditions, genetic changes, environmental experiences, life experiences that impact on patients. The only way to understand that is to study patients, study people. And of course, the work that you're doing to help bring families, not only the patients, but the rest of the families to bear, to help us with this process. It is a partnership. We cannot do it, no matter how much philanthropic money we get, or how much money the government gives us, and how brilliant our scientists are. And all of those are in play. We can't do it without the partnership with our patients. That's what we depend on to make progress. And so thank you for, and all of the people that you're representing here, for making that happen.
Well, thank you for your time today, Dr. Rosen. The passion and the information that you provided today, I hope will inspire one of our listeners, if they're not already engaged in research, to reach out and say, I'd like to learn more. I'm interested to find out what studies am I eligible for? How can I contribute?
Please do. For all of you that may be watching or listening, we very much welcome your involvement. We'll take very good care of you, and I can assure you that what you'll contribute will help people in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Rosen. I know we'll be in touch again soon. The research projects that we conduct in the MGH FTD unit could not be done without a robust team of dedicated staff, scientists, and clinicians. Some very important members of our research team are our clinical research coordinators. And I'm happy to introduce you to some members of our CRC team today.
So I'm Erin Cron. I'm a senior clinical research coordinator at the Dickerson lab, and I work mainly on the all-FTD study in our family study. And we have quite a large role. So we do a lot of different things. Coordination, of course, is in the job title. So we do a lot of coordinating with the research participants and, of course, all the clinicians in the lab. And then we also do like regulatory things. We work with a lot of forms, but then on the kind of more procedural side during the research visits, we also help with things like the MRI and the blood draws. And then overall, it can be a very long day sometimes. And so we also, we do a lot of support. We make sure people feel comfortable with the process. Any questions are answered and that, everyone's being listened to. I find this job meaningful for a few different reasons, but one of the main ones just being that being in a position where we can make people feel a little bit more supported, feel a little bit more comfortable, and during experience that can be a little bit hard sometimes, just working with people with various diagnoses, people who might have genetic variants in their family that might be a little bit scary sometimes. Just being able to support them and make them feel heard can feel very meaningful. And then I'm inspired daily by this position as well, by all the people we work with for a very similar reason. But just that despite, sometimes being in a hard time, the dedication that people have for participating in research is very inspirational. So, whether people are very optimistic or maybe people are a little bit more unsure about the process, either way, I'm very inspired by their dedication and their time spent with us.
My name is Ainola Howe, and I'm a clinical research coordinator with the Dickerson lab. So my primary studies are the caregiver studies, which right now looks like caregiver well-being study, as well as we are launching our AIM-3 of the caregiver video intervention, which will be a clinical trial, which is very exciting. I'm also helping out with a PET scan imaging study called New Ideas, which is looking at making those scans accessible to people on Medicare and Medicaid. So a CRC basically makes sure that the studies sort of keep happening. We do a lot of the administrative tasks, a lot of the paperwork. We reach out to our participants, we schedule them, we work on recruitment. Of course, we have the participant visits, and then we do the back end stuff. So data entry, a little bit of analysis. So pretty much start to finish, we really help the research study just move smoothly. Honestly, getting to work with this population is so incredible. It's a population that I had no experience with previously, so I wasn't sure, how I would like it or how I would really fit into the picture. And I've come to love it so much. I think, especially in the Dickerson lab, what's really cool is I'm involved in our clinic as well. And so we really use research to enhance clinical care. So seeing how people are able to get the next level of care and seeing how impactful that is to the patients and their families has been really inspiring. One of them was during the first part of the caregiver video intervention, the focus group. And it wasn't just one particular caregiver either. It was everyone sort of across the board, how much love they shared. And we're talking about what is a dark and difficult topic. And overwhelmingly, it kept going back to, I love my partner, I love my mom, my child, whatever the relationship being. And so seeing how people were able to focus on the positive aspects was really inspiring, even in the middle of, a really intense advanced care planning conversation. And then patient-wise, I met a lovely one of our participants, and he pulled me aside during a patient visit and said, you are all so nice. Thank you for being so nice to me. And I was just sort of like, of course, like, you are one of the reasons why we do what we do. And he was so sweet. He told me to have a great weekend. And it was just the nicest thing. And seeing, how happy and how full of life he was, even with this difficult diagnosis, was also really inspiring.
Hello, my name is Katie Cunningham, and I am a clinical research coordinator in the Dickerson lab. I just started about 3 months ago, so I am running support for a bunch of different studies, including some of the studies that the other coordinators are directly in charge of. But the study that I myself am directly in charge of is called PACT, or Progressive Aphasia Characterization and Tracking. So PACT looks at people with a disorder called PPA, primary progressive aphasia, which typically manifests in language difficulties. So it is a longitudinal study that follows them for, I think it's 5 years, but as far as I understand, it just sort of continues going as long as people would like to participate. But it consists of a speech language evaluation and a neuropsych evaluation. And it's sort of done every year so that we can track people over the progression of their disorder. So a lot of what I do, particularly for the PACT study, is scheduling and running communication between the speech language team and the participants. So trying to figure out times that work for both to do an evaluation. I'm also getting trained on administering the neuropsych testing battery. So hopefully sometime soon, I will also be administering those tests myself. And other than that, it's sort of just talking to the participant at the end of the day, sending them to different resources that they might think is helpful, because although PACT is not technically involved in any clinical care, we do use it to help guide some of the clinical care at our lab. So a lot of times we will use it as an initial evaluation to then refer people to speech therapy, and we'll send the results of those evaluations along with that. So I help try to connect them to certain resources. So the role of our, I'm getting caught up in my words. So the role of a CRC is very much a patient-facing role. So a lot of the time, the first interaction research participants have is with us as CRCs when we reach out over email to schedule or over the phone. And we usually are the first faces they see even over Zoom, because we're the ones who are running the consents and talking them through what different aspects of the visit might entail. And we do run a lot of the portions of the visit ourselves, the ones that we are qualified to do. So like for a lot of studies, we will run the MRIs and whatnot. For PACT, we don't necessarily have MRIs, but I am getting trained on doing the neuropsych battery administration. So that's another example where we would be the sort of face of the research study for the participants. And alongside that comes oftentimes answering a lot of questions that the participants might have about research, and providing resources to them. So PACT as a study does not necessarily provide any direct clinical relevance, but it can be used to guide clinical care in our lab and elsewhere. So a lot of times our speech language evaluations are a starting step. And then they'll be used for speech therapy referrals. So we will send those, send the results of those evaluations out so that they can help the patient. Well, I have always said that people in general are my passion. I love working with people, and I like knowing that I'm making a difference in helping people. So the fact that a research coordinator, and especially in the Dickerson lab compared to a lot of other research coordinator roles, is very, very patient facing. And you get a lot of interactions with participants. It really meant a lot to me when I was looking for what I wanted in a job. And even more than that, we have had certain family members with not frontotemporal dementia, but with Alzheimer's. And I know firsthand just the sort of impacts that it has on a family and a participant in general. And so it is research that's interesting to me, and I understand firsthand what the importance of the research is, because it's a difficult disorder to deal with for both patients and clinicians, and I just like being there to help out however I can. I think in general, just seeing how many people are working so hard to conduct research and look for cures and gather as much information as possible, it's really heartwarming. And I think in particular, the fact that so many of our participants are going out of their way to come in and engage in research for us. They don't have to do it. It's emotionally, they are going through so much, and they still make the time to come and participate in these research studies because they know that the research might be able to help someone else down the line. And that is just so heartwarming. And it's something that we hear all the time from our participants is, I know this research might not directly help me, but it'll help other people later. And I want to make sure that I'm doing that and leaving an impact. And it really is just so touching that people are that they just want to help. And it gives me a lot of hope for the future.
So hello, my name is Anna Eustace, and I am a clinical research coordinator in the Dickerson lab. So the studies that I'm responsible for is I'm primarily responsible for running the MGH site of the longitudinal early onset Alzheimer's disease study. This is a multi-center study that has multiple sites throughout the country, and we are looking at the progression of early onset Alzheimer's in adults who are between the ages of 40 and 64. Through the study, we gather a whole bunch of information, but that includes some cognitive testing, an MRI, a couple of PET scans, a lumbar puncture, and a blood draw. And so as a CRC, my job is essentially to collect all of the research data hands-on. So my primary responsibility is running the research visits. So on a research visit day, I will be involved in obtaining informed consent, drawing blood, running an MRI, administering cognitive testing. So it's a very busy job. Outside of research visit days, I will also be in charge of some administrative duties, such as the upkeep of the regulatory side of our projects, just to make sure everything is being run as it should be. And so why is this job meaningful to me? I feel so grateful to be able to make a tangible difference in the fight against these rare forms of Alzheimer's disease. It's so beautiful to see such brave individuals come and donate their time to science and selflessly give us their time and sometimes, their bodies to help fight against this horrible illness. We all have this shared hope of finding a cure one day. And then this job is honestly inspiring every single day I'm on site. Just being able to work with the incredible clinicians and physicians who are part of our team is so inspiring and thought-provoking. And it's wonderful to see how they react with the patients and how they go above and beyond against the fight for a cure.
Thank you so much for watching our webinar, Understanding the Research Experience. If you're interested in participating in research, reach out to us. Go to our website, www.ftdboston.org, to learn more about our active research projects and how you can get connected to be a research participant. In order to work together towards effective treatment, a cure, and one day prevention of Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and related disorders, we all need to work together. I look forward to being a part of research with you. Thank you.